Hi, this is Graham Johnson together with Ludovic Altin, and today I want to show you some of the tools we use to construct this photorealistic scene that has a bunch of the molecules from this issue of structure rendered as physical sculptures sitting on an artist's workbench. And I'm going to just highlight a couple of the tools. We're not going to rebuild the entire scene, although we will do that and provide that in the coming weeks on the site epmv.scripps.edu. But for now I'm just going to show you the basic elements, the basic tools you would need to get started to construct a scene like this of your own. And to do that, we're going to use a software package that I prefer called Cinema 4D. It's famous for its user friendliness, and this plugin in this little window called the Embedded Python Molecular Viewer that you can read about in the paper functions in many other professional 3D software applications, including the freely available Blender and the workhorse of Hollywood Maya and several others that are Python-aware packages. I deliberately constructed this scene using basic elements or freely available elements. In this case, we're going to start with an example scene provided by the manufacturer that highlights a rendering technology that all of these packages have available, but Maxon Cinema 4D calls theirs global illumination, and that does a photorealistic lighting. So I've opened their global illumination highlight scene, and what this scene is comprised of is, I'm just going to go to a different view here, perspective view and garage shading. It's a little room with a camera inside of the room and two-dimensional walls with a floor. And if we zoom out here, and a single light source outside of that room, shown here in white, that is mimicking the sun and shining in through this window onto the surface and bouncing around the room. And what that results in, if you do not use this technique called global illumination and you have shadows turned on in the light, is a pretty dark scene where the ray tracing that's being used calculates a single ray of light. Once it hits an object, it calculates how that light is reflected back to the camera and how it's perceived in the final image. But when we turn on global illumination, and I've got to lower some of these settings because it's a relatively expensive calculation so that we can see the results in a timely fashion for this highlight video. The light is actually allowed, or it's simulated, to bounce around inside of the room, to bounce off of an object onto the floor, off of the floor onto the object, and picking up properties of light as it would from these different diffuse surfaces as it bounces around. So it's calculating in a much more realistic manner the interaction of light and all the objects in the room, and the interaction of the objects in the room against one another, and picking up little bits of red from these rose petals on the inside of this cup, and warm overcasts into the cast shadows from the light from the floor into the shadows on the wall, and much cooler shadows over in the back regions of the room where it's mostly just white light reflecting off of the interior of the room itself, etc. And what we want to do now is use the embedded Python molecular viewer to drop some molecules into the scene. I'm just going to do one or two just to show you how it works and some tricks you can use to speed up the interactions. And here I'm going to just create a coarse molecular surface. And again, I'll have detailed tutorials stepping you through every mouse click essentially here, but right now I just want to show you what's available. I'll also explain some of the moves I'm making in the software. But first we'll let this render. And you can see in 3D it's really difficult to position things in space, but I'll show you how. You're probably familiar with that in a molecular viewer. I might get this object close to where I want it and see that it's either hovering way up in the sky or it's cutting through an object like the sphere and the floor, which I just deliberately did for you. I'll show you some of the advantages of working inside the 3D viewer, or sorry, inside of the typical graphic user interface that's available in all of these ubiquitously in all these professional 3D software applications, including Maya, the workhorse of Hollywood, Cinema 4D, the software preferably used by medical illustrators, and Blender, which is popular with scientists because it's open source and it's freely available. And they're all these software packages have advantages and disadvantages, but they are all similar in power and capability. And then bringing molecular modeling to that with ePMV greatly enhances that power and capability. So we've rendered the scene. Again, it's cutting through. An advantage that's often overlooked inside of software like this is this type of multi-view panel where in real time I can manipulate the object. I can see that it's cutting through this black line which represents the floor, and I can pull it up. And I can even use the rotation tool to try and balance it in a more realistic manner as if it were a solid object interacting with gravity. But another feature I could use in this 3D world is the physics feature that's available. And that's how I did most of the modeling in this scene that's used on the cover of Structure this month. And I just want to apply a tag to this molecule to make it a rigid body, and then a tag to the room itself to make it a special kind of rigid body called a collider object that is not going to react to gravity and start falling at the same rate when I push play. And now if you look in this window, and I push play, the object will settle onto the floor. I've got to adjust one more setting here to get it to settle all the way to the floor. And again, it might look like I'm making a great deal, way too many mouse clicks here. But I'll show you what each of these mean if anybody wants to follow along in the future. I've just hit render again, and we should see from the lighting that the object is actually much closer to, that the shadows are indicating that the object is resting on the floor instead of hovering in space or floating, or cutting through the floor, that is, sorry. And you can see from the reflection here that the dark shadow is meeting the object right here, and that gives you a visual cue, and the shadow itself is darker right underneath, that the object is sitting on the floor, unlike this version down here which is cutting through the floor. So that's one thing. We have physics, we have the ability to bring in molecules, we have the ability to apply any type of physics to those molecules, whether it's human scale gravity or molecular scale dynamics, and we have the ability to do some very interactive, simple and easy modeling, which is contours. And we can do this either interactively like I just showed, or you can do it quite precisely by entering numbers into the settings, X, Y, and Z coordinates here. You can grab a rotation tool and spin this thing around. And I'm actually making a shelf to place the molecule on, so I want to round the corners of it just a little bit. So I've turned this cube into a shelf. I'm just going to set it at this rotation, and then I'll use the 4-panel view. Display lines so I can see through the room, and it would be handy to use a top view here so I can slide the shelf right up against the wall like that and position it so it's not colliding against the spheres. And then we can move the camera out a little bit. And now let's take this molecule and let's actually we'll make a ribbon molecule. And let's make a molecular surface as well. Just color everything the same. And I'm just going to position these objects on the shelf. And the molecular surface. Again, I'll explain some of these moves that I'm doing in shorter tutorials in the future. So we've got molecular surface, ribbon, and of course molecular surface all rendered down here. And I'll hide the original geometry so it's no longer rendered cutting through the floor there. And again, we can zoom in on these objects in multiple views to be able to manipulate them. And I see, even though it looked like when I was working in 3 dimensions that these were sitting on the shelf, they're actually, if I were to apply the gravity, they would just have fallen right off that shelf because they were right near the edge, and I'd really like to snug them back into the corner here. And then apply the same tag to each one of them. If I hit play, then these should also fall. Oh, and they fell right through the shelf, of course, because I didn't tell the shelf to have physics function on it. So now again, I've turned it into a collider object, so it's non-responsive to gravity, and we can see in all these views and from all these angles that these objects fall the way that they would in real life and settle on a nice, comfortable, low-energy position where they're balanced realistically onto the surface. And before I hit render, let's just add a nice wood texture. And we could build our own, but that will take a little bit too much time, so I'm just going to grab one that folks at Maxon have provided for us. And it's the one I used in the scene, again, with the intention of being able to quickly help any interested parties out there construct these things for themselves, reconstruct this entire scene. Now I'll hit render. And we've started calculating the pre-pass then we get more more detailed versions of the pre-pass as it figures out which objects are interacting, which objects are close to other objects, and then which objects are catching light from other objects versus shadow, how much light there is, what the intensity of it is, what the color of it is, and then that all gets applied into the final rendering of the scene. Again, the global illumination is a relatively expensive technology. If I were to render this scene just with standard lights, as I did in the very beginning of the movie, we just had the regular ray tracing turned on, this entire scene would render in a matter of a few seconds if it took more than 1 second on this machine I'm using. And so more or less with these techniques and just adjusting all the parameters until they looked the way I liked them, moving the camera around till I found a comfortable view that fit every object. I was able to position all 9 of the molecules in this scene and to play with them in ways that makes them look like they were on an imaginary 3D molecular sculptor's workbench, where one of them's being carved out. One of the molecules was molded into a candle and is melting, and some of the others are being painted, when in reality you can build those, at least for a 3D virtual model, relatively quickly and easily directly with ePMV inside of any of these viewers. Thank you.